Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with a lecture for Anatomy and Physiology 1 on pancreatic hormones and the disorder diabetes. So there are a few hormones that regulate blood glucose: insulin, glucagon, cortisol, and epinephrine. But only one of these lowers our blood glucose. This is insulin. And since it lowers blood glucose, we call it hypoglycemic. And it's synthesized by the pancreas. There are three hormones that raise blood glucose. Any hormone that does so is called hyperglycemic, and the one made by the pancreas is glucagon. The other two, cortisol and epinephrine, are made by the adrenal gland, although in different parts of the adrenal gland. We're going to start with the pancreas here and have a separate lecture for the adrenal gland. So the pancreas is located in the abdominal pelvic cavity, just beneath the stomach. And it's considered both an endocrine and an exocrine gland. The exocrine portion you can see is darker stained. Histologically, it's the dark regions. And you can see the duct that would carry any secretions from the exocrine cells to the small intestine. Recall that endocrine glands or cells would release their secretions directly into the blood. That's what makes them endocrine cells. So the portion of the pancreas that contains endocrine cells are these light-colored groupings of cells. These are called the islets of Langerhans. If we look at kind of a schematic diagram of an islet of Langerhans, you see that there are different types of cells, and they can be stained with different antibodies so that we can recognize them. You aren't responsible for doing that, but they are a little bit different. One type of cell is called a beta cell, and it makes insulin. And the other type of cell is called an alpha cell, and that type of cell makes glucagon. So the stimulation of insulin and glucagon production is humoral, and that means that there's a parameter of some sort in the blood that's recognized by a sensory component in the pancreas, and a hormone is made in response. And of course, the parameter is the level of glucose in the blood. When blood glucose is high, then the pancreas makes insulin. Insulin lowers blood glucose so that it goes back down to a normal level. If blood glucose drops too low, then the pancreas secretes glucagon, and that causes the blood glucose to rise, and so a normal level is reached again. So the actions of these two hormones are kind of interesting. The overall effect of insulin, just remember, is to lower blood glucose. But where does the glucose go? Well, it's taken up by cells, for example, by the liver. The liver uses the glucose for any needs that it has for metabolism, making ATP and any other chemical reaction that can use glucose, but it can also store the glucose in the form of glycogen. In addition, insulin stimulates most of our cells to take up glucose as well. That means the insulin leaves the blood and is transported across cell membranes into these cells. Once the glucose is taken out of the blood and taken up by these other cells, then the blood glucose level drops down to a normal range. There are many more actions of insulin, and there are also some other stimuli for insulin release. For example, elevated levels of amino acids and fatty acids would increase insulin production. And the parasympathetic nervous system also causes the release of insulin from the pancreas. That makes sense because we know that the parasympathetic nervous system is important to the digestion and normal metabolism. There are also additional targets besides just the liver, and I just before mentioned them as other cells in your body taking up the glucose. But adipose tissue, for example, responds to insulin by making triglycerides. And skeletal muscle responds to insulin by taking up the glucose, but then making proteins and producing glycogen. Muscles can store glucose as glycogen, much like the liver can. Now, there are some cells in your body that don't require insulin to take up the glucose out of the blood. That would be the brain, the kidney, and erythrocytes. The liver can do so, but insulin really helps the liver take up the glucose. So it does respond. This is a slide to show you how insulin can actually help cells take up glucose or transport glucose. So glucose, to get inside of a cell, needs a transport membrane protein called GLUT4. There are some others, but this is the one that we'll focus on. So GLUT4 is this purple transport channel or protein, whatever you want to call it. And it enables glucose to get into the cell. Now, it is synthesized in cells like any other protein. But what insulin does is it stimulates vesicles that contain the transporter to fuse with the membrane, like secretory vesicles do. And therefore, the GLUT4 transporter is put into the membrane, and now the glucose can enter the cells. That's not really part of your study question, but it's kind of interesting because we learned about protein synthesis. We learned about how secretory vesicles fuse with the membrane. Okay, let's look at the other hormone made by the pancreas now, and it's glucagon. So we're going to look at its action. So glucagon, remember, its overall effect is to raise blood glucose. The stimulus for its release is low blood glucose, and it acts on the liver, causing the liver to break down its stored glycogen. And when glycogen is broken down, glucose is produced, because that's what glycogen is a string of glucoses. So once the liver has broken down the glycogen into glucose, now it releases the glucose into the blood. That causes blood glucose levels to rise, and homeostasis is restored. Now there's other stimuli for glucagon secretion, particularly amino acids. So a high level of amino acids, like after a high protein meal, amino acid levels in the blood go up, and that triggers glucagon release. And glucagon acts in the liver not just to break down glycogen, but it also causes the liver to make new glucose. So gluconeogenesis. And this glucose is made from amino acids, lactic acid, and fatty acids. Glucagon also stimulates adipose to break down triglycerides, which would make fatty acids that could be used to make the glucose. And in the intestine, glucagon stimulates the absorption of amino acids so that the protein that we do eat actually gets into our bloodstream. The sympathetic nervous system can stimulate the pancreas to release glucagon, and that will help raise blood glucose in times of fight or flight. Now, there's an endocrine disorder that I'm sure you've heard of called diabetes, but we are going to give it its full name today, diabetes mellitus. Some people say diabetes mellitus. And in this case, or this disease, there's too little insulin action. Either there's not enough insulin made, or the insulin that is made isn't effective. Okay, it's not doing whatever job, any of its jobs very well. So that means that the blood glucose in the blood will stay high, or the level of glucose in the blood will stay high. And because glucose is not being stored to be used to make ATP, we see other energy storage molecules being broken down to make ATP. So we have weight loss. And anytime you've got a high concentration of solutes, such as glucose, in the blood, the hypothalamus is triggered and we have this sensation of thirst. That excessive thirst sensation is called polydipsia. Also, anytime you have excessive or extra glucose in the blood, the kidney is going to filter out the glucose as best it can, and we will urinate it. Okay, but when we filter out a solute like that, water usually follows the solute. So the urine will be copious. There will be a high volume of urine, and in the urine you will find the glucose, and the volume is due to the water that followed the glucose. In addition to the fact that you have glucose in the urine, you'll also have ketone bodies in the urine. Now, ketone bodies are acidic, and they are made in response to breaking down fat. And remember, we break down fat in diabetes because the cells are not able, or the insulin's not working for glucose uptake. So cells need some sort of energy source, and fat provides the energy source. So when fat is broken down to be used by cells to make ATP, one of the things that's made from that breakdown of fat are ketone bodies. And because ketone bodies are acidic, the pH of the blood goes down, the pH of the urine goes down, and often carbon dioxide levels in the blood go up. So there's some severe complications that result from this drop in pH, increase in carbon dioxide due to ketone bodies, as well as excessive glucose. Many of the complications are a result of nervous system dysfunction, like adult blindness, peripheral neuropathy. But in addition, we get kidney failure. The kidney's working so hard, and we've got so much sugar around, so much glucose, probably leaking out of the blood into the tissues, but not being taken up by the cells, just floating on the outside in the extracellular fluid, that we often get infections because bacteria have a great energy source. So gangrene can develop, and it can be so severe that you have to do limb amputations or toes or whatever. We also have degeneration of the cardiovascular system, and I'm not exactly sure why the heart would be a problem, but the vessels would be a problem because they're going to experience this high level of glucose and possible infection as well. So this slide is a summary basically of what I was just talking about, the pathogenesis of diabetes mellitus. Why is it a problem? Well, the problem is that cells cannot absorb glucose, which they need to make ATP. So they have to use alternate energy sources like fatty acids and amino acids. So glycogen is going to be broken down in skeletal muscle and the liver for those organs to use locally. Okay, so skeletal muscle will lose its energy source. The liver will lose its energy source as well. But throughout that's not going to last very long. Throughout the rest of the body, we have adipose tissue, we have protein, and of course, there's also fat. Well, that's fine, adipose tissue. So adipose tissue has triglycerides, and those triglycerides are broken down by a process called lipolysis and then beta oxidation, and that produces fatty acids that can be converted to acetyl-CoA to make ATP. Okay, but in addition, sometimes ketone bodies are made, and the liver often converts the acetyl-CoA into ketone bodies that can be used by cells, but there's too many ketone bodies, right? So there's too much in the blood, and that causes the pH to drop. So that's all about fat, using fat instead of using a carbohydrate. Now, protein breakdown also occurs. It's going to make muscle weakness occur, right? And the reason that the body breaks down proteins is that these amino acids can be converted into glucose by the liver. And so gluconeogenesis occurs. Well, that's just going to increase blood glucose. So that's not going to help a lot. Sorry, the slide is going crazy here. Okay, my slide's not going crazy anymore. So we have severe weight loss due to decreased fat stores, and you have muscular weakness due to protein catabolism. Not great. This slide is just for your information. What's the problem with hyperglycemia? Why is that bad? And why are ketones bad? Well, ketones are acids, so when there are a lot of ketones in the body and the blood pH drops, we call that condition ketoacidosis. Now, ketones in the body, in the blood, release hydrogen ions. And in the blood, we have this other ion called bicarbonate. They automatically combine to form carbonic acid, which, at least in red blood cells, is converted into water and carbon dioxide. So often when somebody is in the condition of ketoacidosis, you'll see that their respiratory rate increases to get rid of excess CO2. And with hyperglycemia, we see glucose and ketone bodies in the urine, which I've mentioned previously. And when the kidney is forming urine by filtering the blood, that's what it does. Usually these ketone bodies and glucose are reabsorbed back into the blood. The kidney always tries to keep what's good and get rid of what's bad. So these are energy sources. So normally the kidney does reabsorption. Well, there's just too many. So the kidney cannot reabsorb all of the glucose and ketones, and that pulls water out of the blood and electrolytes. So you lose a lot of electrolytes and water when you have hyperglycemia. Now, the type of diabetes that I've been talking about is type 1 diabetes. Sometimes it's called juvenile onset, although there are other classifications now. But what I think is the most important is to recognize that this type of diabetes is dependent on insulin. Okay, so what has happened is the beta cells in the pancreas have been destroyed, or they're not producing as much insulin. So without as much insulin around, of course the blood glucose will get high, will develop hyperglycemia. This could be caused by a genetic abnormality, or it could be caused by a viral infection. So this is what I've been talking about so far, is insulin production is low. There's another type of diabetes, which we call non-insulin dependent. Most clinically seen diabetes is actually this type 2, and at least in our country. And what has happened is our cells have become resistant to insulin. So even though insulin is around, cells can't transport glucose into the cytoplasm. Now, why this happens, no one knows exactly. There's a lot of speculation. But we do notice a link with obesity and inactivity, and of course age and a genetic component as well, but that lends itself more to a new type 1, 2, I don't know what you'd call that. So the obesity factor, why they think that obesity might cause insulin resistance, is that fat cells, which there are a lot of in obesity, secrete chemicals that interfere with that GLUT4 transporter. So I've got a couple questions here. How would you treat type 1? Well, since insulin production is negligible or zero, you would treat by giving insulin. And that my grandmother did that for years and years and years, gave herself an insulin shot. How would you treat type 2? Well, efforts are directed towards decreasing obesity and increasing activity, with more or less success in certain cases. There is a closely related, not closely related, a similarly named disorder called diabetes insipidus. It isn't related to blood glucose at all, but it has some similar symptoms. For example, there's a lot of urine output, polyuria. There's excessive thirst, polydipsia. So that made people kind of check out these clinical cases and test for high blood glucose. Well, the blood glucose was normal, and there wasn't a high level of ketone bodies in the blood either. So now we know it's not related to blood glucose regulation because that's in homeostasis. But we're still getting excessive urination and then, of course, excessive thirst. It turns out it's caused by the lack of a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, which is normally made by the posterior pituitary. Antidiuretic hormone means that it helps the body reabsorb water. And since the kidney won't be reabsorbing the water due to the lack of ADH, you have excessive urine production. So that's the end of the pancreatic hormone lecture. The last lecture for the endocrine system will be on the adrenal gland. Thank you.